She still remembered the morning he left, not because it was dramatic or filled with shouting, but because of how ordinary it felt. How he stood near the doorway holding his coat as if he were only stepping out for a moment. How he avoided her eyes while saying he needed time. How she nodded, even though she didn't understand what space meant when no argument had happened. And how the door closed softly behind him without a single promise of return. And in the days that followed, she replayed that moment endlessly, searching for hidden signs she might have missed. A hesitation in his voice, a look of guilt or fear. But all she found was silence. Weeks turning into months without explanation, without a letter or a call, leaving her suspended in a story without an ending. And over the years, she told herself different versions to survive. That he was overwhelmed, that he needed freedom, that love sometimes simply fades. Yet even as life moved forward and routines replaced waiting, that unanswered question remained quietly alive inside her. Not painful anymore, but unresolved, like a chapter someone had torn out of her life without permission. And she never imagined that decades later, a single unexpected detail would force that chapter open again and finally demand the truth she had learned to live without. For a long time, she believed she had learned how to live with the absence, not happily, but functionally, building days that did not depend on answers, learning how to speak about him in the past tense without emotion, how to explain his disappearance to others with carefully chosen words that revealed nothing. And yet, it was a small, almost accidental moment that disturbed that fragile balance. A quiet afternoon when she was sorting through old paperwork and noticed a name that felt familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place. A signature on a document she didn't remember authorizing. And as she stared out at longer, something inside her tightened because it carried his handwriting, unmistakable even after all those years. And suddenly, the past no longer felt distant or settled, but present and unfinished, raising questions she thought she had buried, forcing her to confront the unsettling possibility that his leaving had not been an escape or a choice driven by fading love, but something deliberate, something planned. And as that thought settled in, she realized that what frightened her most was not discovering a painful truth, but discovering that she had been living alongside it unknowingly for most of her life. That night, she barely slept, not because of panic or sudden fear, but because her mind refused to settle, moving slowly and relentlessly through memories she had long categorized as finished. Questioning details that once seemed insignificant, like the way he had grown quieter in the months before he left, how he often stared at nothing while sitting across from her, how certain conversations ended abruptly as if he were protecting information rather than avoiding conflict. And as the hours passed, she began to understand that his disappearance might not have been an act of abandonment, but an act of containment, a choice made not to escape responsibility, but to shoulder something alone. And this realization unsettled her more deeply than anger ever could, because it reframed the years she spent believing she had been left behind, transforming them into years lived beside an invisible truth. And by morning, she felt an unfamiliar resolve, not to chase him or demand explanations, but to finally allow herself to investigate the version of their life that had never been shared with her, knowing that whatever she uncovered might not bring comfort or closure, but it would bring coherence. And for the first time since the door had closed behind him all those years ago, she felt she was moving forward, not away from him, but toward an understanding that had been postponed for far too long. She spent the following days moving through her routine as if everything were normal, answering messages, preparing meals, smiling when required. Yet internally, her attention was fixed on a growing pattern she could no longer ignore. Because once she allowed herself to question the past honestly, details began aligning in ways they never had before. His sudden concern with paperwork, the quiet urgency with which he organized finances, the way he insisted she sign certain documents without explanation, framing them as practical necessities rather than decisions. And as she revisited those moments now, she understood that he had been preparing not to leave her emotionally, but to remove himself physically while ensuring her life would remain intact. And this realization carried a weight that was neither comforting nor cruel, but deeply destabilizing, because it suggested a love expressed through secrecy rather than presence. And as she searched old records and slowly reconstructed the timeline, she felt an unfamiliar mixture of grief and respect, mourning not just his absence, but the version of their relationship that had been shaped by silence, realizing that she had lived decades believing she was abandoned when in truth, she might have been protected from something he believed she could not carry. And this possibility forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth of her own, that love does not always arrive as honesty, and that sometimes the deepest betrayals and the deepest acts of care wear the same face until time finally separates them. The night she finally allowed herself to stop searching for definitive answers, she sat alone in the quiet of the living room and realized that the true weight of what had happened was not hidden in documents or timelines, but in how profoundly her sense of trust had been shaped by absence. Because for years she had learned to fill silence with assumptions, to interpret distance as rejection, and to carry guilt for questions she never asked. And now, as the pieces slowly settled, she understood that the story she had told herself was incomplete, not because she was naive, but because no one had given her the full truth. And this understanding stirred a complicated ache, one that was not purely sadness or relief, but something heavier and more mature. The recognition that love can coexist with fear, that people sometimes make decisions believing they are sparing others pain while quietly rewriting their lives without consent. And as she reflected on her own choices, the compromises she had made, the moments she had silenced her intuition to preserve stability, she saw that this experience was forcing her to confront not just his actions, but her own willingness to accept uncertainty as normal. And in that stillness, she made a quiet decision, not about forgiveness or confrontation, but about herself, deciding that whatever truth remained undiscovered would no longer define her future, because clarity, even when incomplete, had already begun to restore something essential inside her, a sense of ownership over her own story that she had not realized she had been missing for so long. In the days that followed, she noticed subtle changes in herself that felt both unfamiliar and strangely grounding, as if her mind had finally stopped circling the same unanswered questions and instead began observing the present with sharper honesty, because ordinary moments now carried a different weight. Conversations sounded clearer, silences less threatening, and she started to recognize how much energy she had spent over the years bracing herself for disappointment without ever naming it. And this awareness was not dramatic or sudden, but gradual, unfolding in quiet realizations, like noticing how tension leaves the body only after it has been gone for some time. And as she replayed memories that once felt confusing or painful, she could now see them through a lens shaped by context rather than self-blame, understanding that what had hurt most was not the event itself, but the long uncertainty that followed, the feeling of being suspended between truth and imagination. And with that insight came a surprising calm, not because everything made sense at last, but because she no longer needed it to, realizing that closure does not always arrive as a clear explanation, but sometimes as the moment you stop waiting for one. And in choosing to move forward without demanding perfect answers, she felt something steady take root inside her, a quiet resilience built not from forgetting the past, but from finally seeing it without distortion. That evening, as she sat alone with the quiet hum of the house around her, she allowed herself to think not about what had been lost, but about what had quietly survived, realizing how many versions of herself had existed within the same life, each shaped by choices made under pressure, fear, or hope. And for the first time, she did not judge those versions harshly, but regarded them with something close to compassion, understanding that endurance is often mistaken for weakness when it is, in fact, a form of strength learned over time. And as she reflected on the years spent adopting, compromising, and adjusting her expectations to preserve peace, she saw how that instinct, once necessary, had slowly turned into a habit of silence, one that kept her safe but also small. And this recognition did not fill her with regret so much as resolve, because she could now separate who she had been from who she was becoming. And in that separation, there was room to breathe, to imagine a future shaped not by reaction, but intention. And while uncertainty still existed, it no longer felt like a threat, but an open space, one she could enter without rehearsing worst-case outcomes, knowing that whatever came next would be met with clarity rather than denial. And as she turned off the light and prepared for rest, she felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle in. Not excitement or relief, but the quiet confidence that comes when a person finally trusts their own perception after years of doubting it. The following days unfolded slowly, marked not by dramatic confrontations or sudden revelations, but by a series of small, almost invisible moments that quietly reshaped her sense of reality. Moments like noticing how calm she felt waking up without the familiar tension in her chest, or how her thoughts no longer circled endlessly around explanations she would never receive. And as she moved through her routine, she became aware of how much energy had once been spent maintaining an emotional balance that was never truly shared. And this awareness did not come with bitterness, but with a sober clarity that felt grounding rather than heavy, because she could finally see the pattern clearly, how love had slowly turned into endurance, how hope had disguised itself as patience, and how silence had been mistaken for loyalty. And instead of reliving these realizations with pain, she observed them with a detached honesty, understanding that growth often arrives quietly, without ceremony, disguised as acceptance. And when memories surfaced, they no longer demanded a response. They simply passed through her mind like chapters already read. And in that space, she began to recognize a different kind of strength forming, one rooted not in proving anything to anyone else, but in reclaiming her inner narrative. And for the first time in a long while, she felt present in her own life, not bracing for disappointment, not clinging to expectation, but standing firmly in the knowledge that whatever unfolded next would be navigated on her terms, guided by truth rather than habit. The following days unfolded slowly, marked not by dramatic confrontations or sudden revelations, but by a series of small, almost invisible moments that quietly reshaped her sense of reality. Moments like noticing how calm she felt waking up without the familiar tension in her chest, or how her thoughts no longer circled endlessly around explanations she would never receive. And as she moved through her routine, she became aware of how much energy had once been spent maintaining an emotional balance that was never truly shared. And this awareness did not come with bitterness, but with a sober clarity that felt grounding rather than heavy, because she could finally see the pattern clearly, how love had slowly turned into endurance, how hope had disguised itself as patience, and how silence had been mistaken for loyalty. And instead of reliving these realizations with pain, she observed them with a detached honesty, understanding that growth often arrives quietly, without ceremony, disguised as acceptance. And when memories surfaced, they no longer demanded a response. They simply passed through her mind like chapters already read. And in that space, she began to recognize a different kind of strength forming, one rooted not in proving anything to anyone else, but in reclaiming her inner narrative. And for the first time in a long while, she felt present in her own life, not bracing for disappointment, not clinging to expectation, but standing firmly in the knowledge that whatever unfolded next would be navigated on her terms, guided by truth rather than habit. When the moment finally came to move forward, It did not arrive with dramatic declarations or sudden relief, but with a quiet certainty that settled into her like something long overdue. And as she stood at the threshold of what would become the next chapter of her life, she realized that healing had never been about erasing the past or proving that she had survived it, but about integrating its lessons without allowing them to define her. And in acknowledging the truth of what had been lost, she also recognized what had been gained: a deeper understanding of herself, a clearer sense of her boundaries, and a resilience that no longer depended on endurance alone. And while the future remained unwritten, it no longer felt intimidating, because she was no longer stepping into it carrying unanswered questions or borrowed guilt, but with an honesty that felt both grounding and freeing. And as she moved forward, she understood that closure was not something granted by another person, but something she had finally chosen for herself. And in that choice, she found a calm strength, not loud or triumphant, but steady, enduring, and unmistakably her own.